How did 30th Brigade orchestrate effects on the battlefield? We look at combined arms warfare during the Kokoda campaign.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 112 of the Principles of War podcast, the combined arms effect during the Kokoda campaign. We started the episode with the sound of a Japanese heavy machine gun, the Juki, firing, nicknamed by Allied troops as the woodpecker because of its slow rate of fire. The term Juki came from its Japanese designation, which was the Juki Kanju, or heavy machine gun. This is even though it was only calibered for 7.72. It had a maximum range of 4,500 metres, but a practical range of about 800. The Juki was a part of the formula that the Japanese used to generate the combined arms effect during the Kokoda campaign. Now, how did 30th Brigade generate the combined arms effect? Well, that's obviously a trick question because they didn't. And the important question is, why didn't they? So today we'll look at some doctrine to understand what the combined arms effect is. We'll look at why it's important. We'll look at how the Japanese generated it and why the Australians didn't. Before we get into that, I just want to reflect quickly on last week's episode where we looked at friendly fire. Friendly fire is something that is a bit of a taboo. It isn't really spoken about too much. However, it's a fundamental part of combat. I'll include in the show notes for that episode a report that was published in the ARC, the Australian Army Research Centre, Not So Friendly Fire, an Australian taxonomy for fratricide. That was written by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Stevenson. And he starts his report with a quote: "There is, perhaps, no battle in modern warfare where such episodes have not occurred, for their avoidance is a problem for which has so far proved insoluble." Now, that was General Sir Ian Hamilton. He wrote that at Gallipoli in 1915. Gallipoli, over 100 years ago, surely warfare has evolved so that friendly fire is less of a problem. Maybe not. And I'm going to quickly read from an excerpt from About Face, written by Colonel David Hackworth. He did a study of friendly fire for the US Army during Vietnam. And this is what he had to write. "As our study shook out, the fact became inescapable that a staggering 15 to 20% of all US casualties in Vietnam were caused by friendly fire." He went on to write, "But the main problem of friendly fire casualties, unrealistic, unsupervised training, was never solved. And of the some 58,000 Americans who died in Vietnam, on the basis of our calculations, between 8,700 and 11,600 of them shouldn't have." This shows the magnitude of the problem and, critically, the most important way that we have to risk mitigate against it: realistic training. And as we've seen, the militia battalions had no realistic jungle training, and the 2nd, 14th, 2nd, 16th, they had no realistic jungle training either, and that is the critical component. The difference between the militia and the 2nd AIF was that the 2nd AIF were battle-hardened. They had combat experience. But in the jungle, the complexity of the terrain, the fundamentally different nature of the tactical problem meant that jungle-specific training was required for them to be combat effective. So we'll leave friendly fire there and we'll move on to combined arms. I'm going to start with some Australian doctrine. We'll then have a look at some UK doctrine. And then we've got an article from War on the Rocks. We're just going to read a small excerpt from that. To be honest, I think these descriptions are a little bit nebulous and it's difficult to actually visualize what that means on the battlefield. But that's okay because I'm going to finish this episode with an interview from someone who led an assault on a position who benefited from the generation of combined arms. And he's going to talk us through how that worked for him and how that enabled him to seize the objective. That'll be an interview with Captain Hugh Dolby from the 39th Battalion as they were assaulting a position at Boona. Starting with Australian doctrine, we've got LWD-1, the fundamentals of land power, and it states that a combined arms team is a case-by-case mix of combat support, and combat service support, and command support elements tailored to a specific combination of mission, threat, and terrain. Increasingly, this will include joint and interagency components. Each team aims to cover the vulnerability of one part of the force with the strength of another. It also presents a dilemma for the enemy by triggering actions to protect against one threat that increase vulnerability to another. Flexible, modular combined arms teams are the basis of the versatility, adaptability, and agility that enable success in contemporary conflict. The ability to conduct combined arms operations and successfully execute close combat is imperative to the application of maneuver. These are the product of an ethos and a training regime that emphasizes the importance of the fighting soldier, a willingness to endure hardship, to apply force appropriately, and to the ability to function as part of a team in lethal circumstances. Army's ethos, coupled with intellectual, moral, and physical exertion, provides the foundation for its soldiers to engage in combined arms close combat. I'll just quickly read the definition of orchestration because that's a critical part of the generation of the combined arms effect. Orchestration is the arrangement of physical and non-physical actions to ensure their unified contribution to the mission. Orchestration requires a high level of cooperation within combined arms teams and is achieved through the disciplined application of accurate and discriminating fire, timely use of information actions, and the effective integration with interagency elements. When lethal force is applied, it must occur with speed, surprise, aggression, and discrimination. Orchestration necessarily involves the coordination of interagency elements. Effective orchestration enables simultaneity, concurrent action throughout the mission space. Simultaneity, if achieved, will potentially overwhelm the decision-making capacity of the enemy and collapse the adversary decision cycle. Part of that, for me, is where it says that it will comprise elements tailored to a specific combination of mission, threat, and terrain. What am I trying to do? Who am I trying to do it to? And what does the operating environment look like? When we look at orchestration, it talks about information actions, which it sounds like, are they talking about some sort of cyber effect? It could be, but it's important to remember that information operations are probably as old as warfare itself. If we have a think about 2nd LL Alamein, there were 2 episodes entirely about the deception plan for 2nd LL Alamein. The generation of the combined arms effect is a tactical action. However, at the operational level, there is lots of tasks that need to be done with a limited number of resources. So how are you going to set your commanders up for success at the tactical level? It's by the allocation of resources. Those information actions that occurred for 2nd LL Alamein ensured that Rommel had the incorrect force structures to be able to defeat Operation Lightfoot. Now I've got the definition of the combined arms approach. This is in Joint Doctrine Publication 0/20 UK Land Power. The combined arms approach is the synchronized and simultaneous application of tactical forces and capabilities across operational domains to create an effect greater than if each element was used separately or sequentially. Through task organization, it reinforces strengths and compensates for weaknesses through complementary grouping. It also imposes dilemmas on opponents by confronting them with multiple threats. Forces are task organized so that if an opponent attempts to protect against one threat, they become vulnerable to another. Lastly, I've just got a short quote from a War on the Rocks article, The Changing Character of Combined Arms, by Benjamin Jensen and Matthew Strohmeyer. Part of their article talks about the nature of combined arms, and it says, just like war, there is an enduring nature and changing character to combined arms. Combined arms involve combining capabilities in a simultaneous manner to prevail. Traditionally, this combination involved indirect and direct fire to support ground maneuver and closing with the enemy. For Stephen Biddle, the essence of combined arms is captured in the concept of force employment. Warfighting is less about mass and more about maneuver, using tempo and targeting to put the enemy on the horns of a dilemma that reduces cohesion. Seen another way, combined arms is about the combination of effects, fire and maneuver, direct and indirect approaches across domains, orthodox and unorthodox ways and means. Combined arms reduce the decision space of the adversary. The more effects a force brings to bear in time and space, the more likely the enemy system is to collapse. It's a great article. I'll include a link in the show notes. Definitely have a read of it. It talks about some of the offsets that are capable in the generation of the combined arms effect, and it also talks about the value in experimentation to ensure that the combined arms effect that you're going to bring to a future battlefield is going to actually be able to generate the required effect on the enemy. And in a time of rapid technological change, this is a very important concept. How does all of this play out at the tactical level? Assuming that you're conducting an armoured assault on a position that is predominantly defended by infantry. the assault will probably go quite well unless they have anti-tank weapons. So you might use artillery to ensure that they're in their bunkers and unable to employ their weapon systems. This is the heart of the dilemma that you want to create. They can use their anti-tank weapons, but if they do, they're then going to be at risk of artillery casualties. Overwhelming firepower for those few short minutes that the tanks close between the range that's covered by their anti-tank weapons. And that's why it's important to remember the logistics capability that is required for the combined arms effect. If you don't have enough ammunition, then you're not going to be able to create a really strong dilemma. Indeed, we were talking about the 2nd 14th last episode. We've talked about them before. They were, of course, it was one of their platoons that undertook the attack at Palliers Hill. The fire support for the attack at Palliers Hill went for 30 minutes, and it was 1 round per minute from a 25-pounder, and that was because all they had was 30 rounds. That wasn't as dire as it sounds because they had well-placed Vickers machine guns that were also able to create the dilemma for the defending Japanese. The defender of our notional position, they may use engineers to create obstacles for the tanks. This now creates a dilemma for the tanks as they're conducting the assault. How are they going to manage the obstacle? Is that going to take them longer? Is that going to increase the amount of artillery that is required to deny the defenders the ability to use their anti-tank weapons? So let's now turn to the Japanese at the Battle of Ishirawa and how they generated the combined arms effect. Important to remember, they did have engineers with them. They weren't working at the tactical level, they were working at the operational level because they were ensuring that the ammunition for the artillery would be able to keep up with the advancing infantry. The Australians in the early days of the Kokoda campaign had little engineering support. For this part of the podcast, I'm going to be relying on Peter Williams' excellent book, The Kokoda Campaign 1942, Myth and Reality. He's done a lot of research in this chapter where we look at the Japanese artillery during the Kokoda campaign. Before we look at the Japanese in depth, I want to point out one important fact, and that is that the Australians, for almost all of the campaign, had no artillery themselves. This meant that there was no counter-battery fire. When we think of the artillery duel, it is important to remember that it is far, far better to give than it is to receive. For the Australian Army, there was no mechanism with which to give. And it wasn't until the Battle of Ishirawa where the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th had started to bring up their 3-inch mortars that there was some capability to reach out further than the range of the Bren gun. The Japanese had 3 types of guns. They had a 75mm gun, the Type 94 mountain gun. Now this weighed 544 kilograms, it had a range of 8 kilometres, a muzzle velocity of 355 metres per second, an elevation of 45 degrees. That's not actually that high. In steep terrain, you run the risk of being crested, and that's where you're not able to get around onto a target if there's a high feature, particularly a steep feature, in between the gun and the target. Importantly for mobility, it could be assembled in 10 minutes, disassembled in 3.5 minutes by day, 5 to 10 minutes longer at night, and it broke down into 11 pack loads. The 75mm gun was the gun that the gunners had used. With the introduction of the 75mm gun, they gave their old 70mm guns to the infantry, and this became the infantry close support weapon. They described it as a mortar gun. It was highly portable, breech loading, on wheels, had a spin-stabilised round, so it wasn't really a mortar, but capable of a high angle of fire. It could be elevated to up to 70 degrees. They also had 37mm anti-tank guns. Now, these could fire a high explosives round. For the very close-in support, they had the knee mortar. Now, this wasn't actually a mortar that you would rest on your knee because it would break your leg, but it would rest in the dirt. They had 3 per platoon, an effective range of 120 metres, and this was the Type 89 grenade discharger. The troops fighting the Kokoda campaign, the Nankai Shitai, was made up of 4 infantry battalions. They were supported by a mountain artillery battalion and 2 engineering companies. With the Japanese force, we see a much more sophisticated approach towards the development of the combined arms effect. The 4 infantry battalions, 3 of them were from the 144th Infantry Regiment, and they were supported with the 2nd 41st Battalion. Regimental headquarters had its own artillery battery. A battery miners had also come across from the 41st Regiment. The 144th battery had two 75 mils and two 37mm guns. And the reduced battery from the 41st Regiment had one 75mm and one 37mm. I'll put in the show notes a table that details which unit had what artillery in support. But not only did the infantry regiment headquarters have a battery, but each of the battalions had a gun section with it. And because of the terrain, they were taking one 70mm gun with them each. In total, there were 13 guns in support of the Nankai Shitai. The total strength of the Nankai Shitai was 3,500 troops. That is about 3.7 guns per 1,000 troops. To gauge the effectiveness of the combined arms effect that was generated by the Japanese, we also need to look at how hard was it to generate that effect. And the Japanese put a lot of effort into it. 940 troops from the Nankai Shitai, or just over 25%, were either moving artillery or ammunition for the artillery. The standard Japanese artillery battalion had 12 guns and 610 men. However, for the campaign on Kokoda, they only took one gun per battery. They normally reduced the number of guns if the terrain was going to be difficult. However, it was assessed that the terrain was going to be nearly impossible for the movement of artillery. So that is why they were only taking one gun. The size of the battery was reduced to 420, and that was because of the need to feed them. Remember, in this logistically constrained environment, you have to move the food for the troops as well. Normally, they would have 230 horses with them. This was reduced to just 45, and that was enough to carry the guns and the first-line ammunition to Kokoda. After that, the guns and the ammunition was man-packed. Interesting little side note, they knew that the horses would be able to find fodder in Kokoda because they'd taken grass samples when they were doing the reconnaissance. And we talked about that in the episode on the Japoe. The total weight of the 13 guns was 5 tonnes, so that would require 160 men to carry it. However, the Japanese, having known how arduous the terrain was going to be, particularly after Kokoda, they ensured that there was going to be 2 crews to carry the guns. So that was 320 personnel allocated to the task of just carrying the guns. And that left 640 for the movement of ammunition. When we look at the artillery logistics, there's a couple of interesting points that come out of it. The first one is that we're using mountain guns in this environment. So the Japanese had experience from the Russo-Japanese War and then with their combat in China. So they understood the effectiveness of mountain guns in difficult terrain. Mountain guns are lighter, they're designed to be broken down into small loads. They often have a high trajectory so that they can fire in steep terrain. The trade-off is made with the fact that the range isn't as far as you would expect for a similar platform. However, as the Australians found out, short is a relative measure because 8,000 metres is a lot longer than anything that the Australians had. The Japanese had done a good job of allocating troops to task because they were able to transport enough ammunition, and feeding the hungry guns is always a problem. They were able to move enough of that so that there was no perceived constraints on the use of ammunition. The 2nd 16th War Diary said that the Japanese seemed to have no shortage of ammunition. The ammunition records for the Japanese guns are a bit spotty. However, it is recorded that one of the guns that fought at Ishirava arrived with 261 rounds. The Japanese used their artillery in 3 roles: indirect fire, direct fire, and close infantry support. The more important question is, how was artillery used in the way that the Japanese fought? Remember, their preferred tactic was to fix at the front and then encircle, ideally to cut off the withdrawal routes. When that happens, particularly for untrained troops, that is the trigger to withdraw from the position. That means that people will be leaving their defensive pits and they're going to be getting up and they're going to start to move. This is the time when most of the casualties will be inflicted, in the withdrawal. You've got troops trying to move, they're out from under cover, and that means that they can be picked off by rifle fire, machine gun fire, or artillery. The artillery also plays a critical role in that fixing role, so that less troops need to be allocated from the frontal assault, which means that a larger force will be able to encircle the enemy. They didn't just have HE, they would also fire smoke on occasion. And you can imagine that would be quite effective in a dank jungle. There's not going to be a lot of wind to blow the smoke away. And it means that the Japanese troops are going to be able to get up incredibly close before they commence their charge. Firing in the indirect role, often more difficult because it requires an observer with communications back to the gun that's firing. Critically for the Japanese, they didn't need to do that too often because of the fact that the Australians weren't able to reach out further than 1,000 metres. However, it was used on occasion, and it was sometimes used when smoke from cooking fires had been observed by the Japanese. At Ishirawa, we saw the 70mm gun from the 2nd 144th Battalion firing at Maroubra Force headquarters at a range of less than 2,000 metres. This would have been in the eastern side of the AO, the eastern side of Eora Creek, where the 53rd Battalion had meant to have cleared the area. Once the Australians had started to bring up their Vickers machine guns, these became priority targets for the Japanese gunners. At Eora Creek, a Vickers was brought up overnight and it was carefully camouflaged. It was discovered at first light the next morning by the Japanese, and it was destroyed along with its crew with just one round. What effect would that have on other machine gunners? What effect would that have on commanders? They would have been thinking, we've now got something that can reach out a little bit further. We've now got a chance to be able to better dominate the terrain. And then with one shot, that Vickers is destroyed. That means that another one is going to have to be brought up, and they're going to have to camouflage it even better. And this starts to hint at the morale impact that occurs when artillery is able to operate with impunity. Once the Japanese had culminated and commenced their withdrawal, the artillery became even more effective. Artillery in the defence has the advantage of the fact that the attackers are not in their defensive positions. They actually have to manoeuvre. And this is why traditionally the counter-battery role is so important. You want to deny the enemy artillery the chance to attack troops as they are moving. For the Australians, there was no luck with this at all. And this slowed up the divisional advance. Both at Templeton's Crossing and at 2nd Eora, Tubby Allen had nothing with which he could deal with it. Major General Paul Cullen, who fought on the Kokoda Track and rose to the rank after the war to Major General, he said that sometimes the artillery was so powerful that it would stop an assault by itself. In the close-up infantry support role, the Japanese would roll up a 37mm gun or the 70mm. Both of these had a lower profile and they would be dragged into position. A British officer in Burma described how the Japanese would use their artillery in this role. One of the weapons the Japs used most adroitly was a field piece, an infantry gun with which would be manhandled easily in forward position and fired over open sights at point-blank range. We nicknamed the shells from these guns whiz-bangs. You would never have time to hear the one that hit you. The Japanese would use the urgent rate of fire. This is 10 to 12 rounds per minute for 2 minutes. You can imagine the devastating impact that this would have on a defensive position and how it would set the conditions for success for a short infantry charge. A report from an Australian surgical team that was serving on the Kokoda Track said that they found that there were 2 types of wounds predominantly in the soldiers that they treated: gunshot wounds and fragment wounds. Now, the fragments were either from shells, grenades, and mortars. A couple of things out of this. Firstly, the Japanese grenades weren't that effective, and the Japanese didn't have any mortars. So this was predominantly wounds that had been caused by artillery. So the Japanese artillery contributed significantly to the casualties that forced commanders to withdraw from positions. It also decreased the morale of the troops. Sometimes artillery fires alone was enough to convince Australian commanders that a position had become untenable. Not only that, but the Japanese were able to create the combined arms effect that would enable successful manoeuvre either through a charge or manoeuvring around the flank of an Australian position. And that is when artillery is used to its best effect, to create the combined arms effect to minimise the casualties of the infantry as they're attacking. We're talking about infantry in this context because of the fact that the Japanese didn't employ any tanks, and they probably couldn't have on the Kokoda Track, but they could have had engineers who they were trying to support them doing their engineering work whilst under fire. Artillery would have been perfect for that. The Japanese also ensured that there was significant logistics capability to ensure that the number of rounds that they were needed were available when and where they needed it. For the Australians, this is not what we see. The fighting on the Kokoda Track was the first time that the Australians had fought away from the road. In Malaya, in Singapore, and definitely in the Middle East, there was usually very good road transport. The Australians could have fought in the jungle in Malaya or Singapore, but their doctrine didn't allow it. They were a motorised element, so they needed to be tethered to that road. The Japanese exploited this weakness relentlessly. This is part of the reason why there was no Australian artillery for most of the Kokoda campaign. It's important to recognise that the first 2 battalions up the Kokoda Track were militia battalions. What was the training that their COs had had in generating the combined arms effect? Did they know how to generate it? Did they understand the importance of it? Or did they just accept the fact that the logistics challenges were insurmountable to create a combined arms effect? We discussed in an earlier episode the training that the mortar platoon had been given, and the fact that they were very poor in the employment of their weapon systems. Maybe this was a factor in the mortar platoon leaving their mortars back at Port Moresby. I think it probably was. However, they didn't bring their Vickers machine guns with them either. The 2nd 14th and the 2nd 16th, they were the first to bring up their mortars. However, they were severely constrained by the amount of ammunition that they had available. In a defensive campaign like this, they should have been able to establish ammunition dumps. This is something that Basil Morrow should have been thinking about. Brigade commanders could have been pushing the artillery forward further earlier and bringing the ammunition up with them, but that didn't happen. And the only time in the entire Kokoda campaign that Australian troops fought with artillery support was at that final battle at Iori Baiwa. 2 guns from the 14th Field Regiment had been manhandled up the track and were able to provide defensive fires, and this was a huge morale boost to the Australian troops. Once the Japanese started their retreat, however, the guns were not able to keep up. It wasn't until July 1942 that the first mountain battery was formed by the Australian Army, and it would be too late for it to fight in the Kokoda campaign. Its first battle would be the Battle of Bunagona. Army realised quite quickly that there was a requirement for a 25-pounder short, and that was made by the Director of Artillery, Brigadier John O'Brien, in September 1942. However, that would be of no solace to the troops in the Kokoda campaign. Force design didn't allow the employment of artillery in the jungle. In New Guinea itself, there wasn't sufficient critical thinking about how the troops were to fight. And this is partially because of the time constraints placed on Australian commanders by the Japanese and their rapid advance, and also a lack of comprehension about how logistics could and should be done over the Kokoda Track. So it's important to remember that combined arms work. This was a lesson that was learnt in the US Civil War, and it was demonstrated again in the Russo-Japanese War. However, most people didn't seem to be understanding what this meant for European armies, and that was why so much blood was shed in the First World War. If you listen to our interview with Robert Lyman, who together with Lord Dannatt wrote the book Victory into Defeat, looked at the way that the combined arms lessons were forgotten in the interwar period, we see what the malaise that occurred for the British Army being replicated in the Australian Army. There was also a lack of a lessons learnt process within the Australian Army. The Battle of Ishirava ended on 31st of August 1942. Just 8 weeks later, in a very different AO in the Middle East, the Second Battle of El Alamein would kick off. This was a true combined arms battle. Infantry supporting armour, supported by artillery, supported by the Desert Air Force, supported by the engineers, supported by a massive logistics effort. In just 13 days, 1.5 million artillery rounds would be fired. As we mentioned at the start, when we looked through the doctrinal descriptions of combined arms, the information actions that had taken place prior to Second El Alamein to ensure that Rommel was not well dispositioned to meet the oncoming attack. Operation Lightfoot would see grievous damage inflicted on the Deutsche Afrika Korps. This would see the start of a retreat that would continue until the Deutsche Afrika Korps met up with the US forces that had landed as a part of the Torch landings. Much of the damage inflicted on the Deutsche Afrika Korps was done by the 9th Division. Morshead, the commander of the 9th Division, was ably supported by his Commander Royal Artillery, Brigadier Ramsay, who at one point commanded 13 regiments of artillery. It is during 2nd El Alamein that we start to see the stonk, the standard concentration. This was a 72-gun fire mission, done as a drill that enabled great flexibility for commanders. However, the message about the importance of artillery had not got through to New Guinea Force. The Japanese, however, they understood this, and this is why 25% of their combat forces were dedicated to the movement of guns and gun ammo. We often see, in the absence of large-scale combat operations, the skills fade regarding the generation of the combined arms effect. It is expensive and difficult to create a combined arms effect. However, if that effect isn't created, then the risk is either to mission failure or to increase casualties, and it's important to remember that. The lesson, however, is frequently forgotten. The British Army forgot the importance of combined arms during the Falklands campaign. The sinking of the Atlantic Conveyor placed logistics constraints on operational planners. This meant that the first attack, the attack on Goose Green, did not have the amount of ammunition or fire support that it required, and it was a near-run thing. That was actually quite an important battle because it was to maintain political tempo for Margaret Thatcher in the United Nations. I'll just read a short excerpt from a report by Lieutenant Colonel Tom Hogan about the use of fire support by 3 Commando Brigade Royal Marines during the 1982 Falkland Islands War. He writes, "Not until 3 June were sufficient aircraft allocated to 3 Commando to lift a second light gun battery, 79 Commando, forward to Mount Estancia to provide relief for the 3 Para and 42 Commando being continuously shelled by Argentine 155s near Stanley. The scarcity of artillery ammunition limited firing to 100 rounds per battery per day. Counter battery and harassing fire were tightly controlled, and many targets of opportunity were not fired in favour of building stocks of ammunition for the final attack. The frustrations caused by this lack of support was apparent in a message Thompson sent to General Moore's headquarters on 4 June. 1. Understand we only have 1 Sea King and 1 Wessex under OPCON tomorrow. 2. This allocation totally inadequate for current resupply tasks, e.g. 2,000 rounds, 105 ammo. 3. No shells, no attack." Moore got the message. Ammunition was arriving by sea into Teal Inlet, and during the next few days, hundreds of Sea King sorties shuttled it and other supplies forward while units were positioned for the final push. So that's Brigadier Julian Thompson telling Major General Jeremy Moore what he thinks of his logistics plan. And Major General Moore, he understood that it was unacceptable. After Goose Green, 85% of all helicopter flights were dedicated to guns or gun ammo. To highlight the effect that was created during the attack, here is a quote from Nick Vore. He was the commander of 42 Commando during the attack. "On the gunner net, the urgent, precise voice of Chris Romberg could be heard constantly designating new targets for our guns. Their fire was being brought down with unerring accuracy almost onto the assaulting groups of Marines. Afterwards, none of us doubted the decisive role our gunners had played in this battle. Over 1,000 shells would fall onto Zoya alone that night, all of them instantly, precisely laid to cover movement, suppress defensive fire, break up resistance. They gave us an overwhelming advantage, only too evident from the shattered enemy strongpoints, the twitching, cowed prisoners so terrified of the incoming artillery." I want to finish up now with a small excerpt from an interview with Captain Hugh Dolby. This was done by Peter Brune when he was writing the book, Those Ragged Bloody Heroes.
Well, is it rude to say the AOF couldn't take going and I wish it did?
Oh, no.
Would you say that was
rude?
rude?
That was rude, yeah.
Hmm?
We came in a fresh battalion. They had done all the hard work. We only had the last defensive position to break down.
But still wasn't bare of skittles, though, was it? You had a pretty tough time.
Yeah, but look, they'd had a far worse time. They've been bashing their head up against frontal assaults. So we tried it, but gee, we suffered some casualties in the frontal assault. I've forgotten which company it was.
I think Mr. Bistrap copped one.
Yeah, that's who it was. That was a B company.
That's when Doherty and he didn't get on. He told Doherty he didn't want the mortar barrage. And he went in there and he reckons he got cut to pieces.
Brill. Yeah. He did too. And I was with Joe Gilmore. I don't know where that bit up. It must have been pulled out. We went, that's right, down the creek. There was a creek on our flank there. Where he went in, I don't know, but by the look of that, it appears as though he was back in reserve at this stage. But he did the initial attack, and he got slaughtered. His troops got slaughtered. They had a lot of casualties, very heavy casualties. We went in under an artillery barrage, not under a mortar barrage. So anybody that says it was a mortar barrage as far as the day we broke into them is wrong. It was an artillery barrage.
A good one?
Yes, it was a good one, and that was when Doherty and Arno had put their heads together and decided that they'd instruct the artillery to fire for, say, 2 minutes past 12 until the infantry, in other words, the platoon commanders, that it was lifting at 12 o'clock. You could hear the guns go off. You got your watch set and you hear 12 o'clock, you hear boom, 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 boom. So, right. You knew it as soon as they landed into it. Well, it landed, and the next thing we were just, you might say we're about 5 yards away, and we were boom, 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 boom. And so everybody hit the bloody ground. The next thing, the shells landing all around us. And, the Japs still had their heads down. Through that, I suppose he would have saved dozens of lives, because
You went in as they were still trying to...
they still had their heads down, and they were knocked off before they got their heads up.
Yeah.
And so Honor said that he and Doherty worked out that it was better for us to lose a couple of men with through your own fire than it was for you to be slaughtered by a Japanese fire. And, well, we didn't appreciate it when you realised that you'd made a mistake. You know, there's another bloody batch of shells on there.
Yeah.
It was...
Not nice
when
at
it
all.
was explained to you, and we only had one casualty from shrapnel in it, because an artillery shell tends to explode forward. It doesn't get any...
You still had to have been lucky.
Those lucky takes. No,
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.